The bells had gone quiet, and the city was left to its breath. Fish stink off the river, smoke on the damp, a low mutter of men who never slept long because King's Landing never let them. Tyrion Lannister sat before a guttering candle that threw a wavering crown onto the wall. He touched the warm wax with one finger until it dented and made a little crater, like a moon. When the wax ran onto his knuckle he hissed, not for the pain but for the way the night pressed around him, listening. The chamber was too large and too elegant for the part he had been made to play. As master of coin he had received accounts and threats in equal measure, 1,000 debts wrapped in silk. As a husband he had been given a girl who would not look him in the eye, and he could not blame her. He had not asked for her, and he would not break her. But King's Landing did not care about consent. It cared about spectacle. You would hate me less if I were cruel, he thought. Cruelty people understood. Restraint only confused them. A knock came, soft as a cat. Tyrion slipped from his chair, his legs stiff. He crossed the rugs with the tiptoe tread of a man who had learned to move without drawing attention, and undid the bar. Varys entered as if he were part of the darkness and had chosen to take on a shape. His silk robes whispered like birds' wings, and the faint perfume on him could not quite smother the noise of the city clinging to him like soot. He closed the door gently with a palm that never pushed, only encouraged. "You play a dangerous game, my lord," Varys said, as if finishing a conversation begun earlier that evening. He smiled without showing teeth and looked at the small crater in the candle's wax. "You keep burning the same finger." "It's a stubborn finger," Tyrion said. "It enjoys defiance." Varys's eyes slid to the bedchamber beyond the screen. "Is your lady wife asleep?" "She is many things tonight, but not asleep, I think." Tyrion took a long swallow of the watered wine the servants had left and grimaced. "The taste of a public union is always bitter." "Bitter," Varys murmured, "and useful." He moved to the window and looked out through the carved stone. The moon rides the bay like a coin in a bowl. Men reach and the bowl moves. "I am not in the humor for riddles." "Then take it plainly. If she remains in this city, your father will make her a broodmare and call it a kindness. When he learns you have not completed the necessary duty, he will be stern. He knows the arithmetic of legacy better than any man alive. And there is a wedding in the Riverlands that—" Varys stopped, head cocked, listening with the entire posture of his body, like a hunter who hears the grass move. "There is a wedding in the Riverlands that should worry those who still believe the realm remembers honor." Tyrion's lips thinned. "You speak like a man who has eaten a rumor and found bones beneath the meat. I speak like a man who hears things that are never written down." Varys turned back. Candlelight made his face less round, harder. "If you knew what walls could hear, if she remains, your wife will become the means by which your father owns the North. The wolf in a golden cage. Your gentleness will mean nothing. Nature does not argue with chains." "And what alternative do you offer?" Tyrion asked. "The sea is clogged with red wine ships and men who would sell their own mothers for a glance from my sister. Where would I take her? Home? She no longer has one." Varys's gaze was patient. "The city has its subterranean ways. I have keys. There is a ship that does not ask questions of authorities when coin speaks louder. Its captain owes old kindnesses. It sails on the morning tide. If, by chance, 2 passengers find their way to its hold before dawn, disguised as ballast, no one need ever know. The ship is bound for the east, but it can be turned north with sufficient gold. White Harbor is hungry for trade. White Harbor, the wolf den with manners." Tyrion felt the wine sit in his stomach like a stone. "You ask me to take a Stark to the city of a man whose sons were bled by our banners. I ask you to give the girl something she has not had since she first rode through the city gate. I ask you to give her choice." Varys drew from his sleeve a small rolled parchment and laid it beside the candle. The wax light showed an odd sigil in cheap black ink, a stylized fish and hook. "Show her this. The captain will know. And one more matter." Varys's smile failed him for a heartbeat. "The boy you call your squire is loyal. He will not betray you, but loyalty drags men into nets they were not meant to swim. Send him away where he cannot be used. I have arranged for him a night's duty with wine enough to convince him he is helpful. Then a distraction that will leave him asleep until the bells of morning. You will not want him at your shoulder tonight. The chamber felt smaller. Tyrion realized the candle had almost burned itself through and the wax was a puddle. If I do this, he said, you know what it will mean. There will be a price in blood, and it will not be ours to pay in the beginning. It never is, Varys said softly. But sometimes the right debt is better than the wrong favor. Tyrion laughed without mirth. You are a very dangerous friend, Lord Varys. I try to be a useful one. Tyrion leaned on the table, looked down at the parchment, and felt the world narrow to the width of his palm. Then he slipped the roll into his doublet, pushed away the wine, and went to the inner chamber. Sansa Stark stood by the window, though it was not truly a window. It was a narrow slit that let in the moon like a sneer. She had taken off her shoes. Barefoot, her toes curled on the rushes. She might have been a girl in some country tower waiting for her father to return from riding. But the city had carved away the country and left glass. When Tyrion entered, she did not flinch, which he took as a victory. She had earned to make herself a statue. It was a skill that kept you whole when nothing else would. Lady Sansa, he said, may I speak with you? She looked at the bed and then at him, as if to make plain the absurdity of asking permission. You may. We are married, he said. Those are the words men will use for us. My father speaks of alliances and children as if they are coins and he the counting house. I cannot defend you from his ambitions if we remain here. She did not move. And if we leave, there are gold cloaks on every street. There are eyes on the very stones. Yes. Tyrion walked closer and kept his hands visible, as if approaching a frightened horse. We will not leave by the streets. He told her then simply what Varys had proposed. The tunnels, the ship, the chance. He did not say it would be safe. He did not say it would fix anything. He watched her face as he spoke, the way her jaw tightened and relaxed, the way he could see the girl and the woman both weighing the world. Why? She asked when he finished. Why would you do this? Because I do not want my father to be right about everything, he said. Because I won't be the chain he uses. Because you are not a thing to be owned. And because I have done many unlovely things in my life, but I will not add this to the list. Her eyes flicked to the bed again. Then they lifted and met his, clear and raw. If we try to run, she said, and we're caught, he will, she swallowed. Your king will make a show of me. Your sister will smile. Yes, he did not soften it. If we try and fail, they will use us to season their meal. She hugged herself. When I was little, she said, we had a cat that could open a latch. I used to sit by the door from the kitchen to the yard and watch for the moment the bar lifted on its own. I told no one. It was a secret between the cat and me. If I told, someone would shut it with a hook and ruin our game. I've been sitting by doors ever since, my lord. In this place, the latches are clever and small. I have been waiting to learn their trick. Tyrion felt, unexpectedly, the sting of tears. He blinked hard. Then perhaps this is our door. She moved to the chest at the foot of the bed and knelt. Beneath folded linens she had hidden the plainest of the dresses bought for her after the wedding decree. A brown wool that could belong to any minor lord's daughter or any careful housemaid. She laid it across the blankets. What do you need me to do? He had prepared answers to many objections. He had none to that. Move softly. Trust me. Forgive me later if you must. She almost smiled. I am not good at forgiving. I am hopeless at it, Tyrion said. We will be poor at that together. They dressed in silence. Tyrion in his most battered leather, Sansa in the brown dress with a faded ribbon at the collar. He cut his hair roughly with the kitchen knife and rubbed the soot of the brazier along his cheekbones to blur familiar angles. He gave her a hood and gloves and a thick shawl that smelled of boiled onions. He tucked the parchment with the fish and hook into the inside of his jerkin and slid 3 small iron keys into his belt. Keys Varys had pressed into his palm 2 nights ago with a warning breath and a ghost of a smile. When they were ready, he offered Sansa his hand. She blinked at it and then put her fingers in his. They were cold. He did not squeeze, merely held. The passage Varys had told him of was older than the city that lay above it. That was how it felt to Tyrion when the wall swung inward on a sigh and stale air breathed out. Dust and dead spiders and the faint smell of iron. The stairs were not built for a man of any sure foot. They wound down like a worm through stone. Sansa moved with careful grace. He stumbled twice and swore each time under his breath and heard, once, a very small sound from her that might have been laughter. Rats fled before them. Water somewhere dripped like a slow clock. Varys had said there would be 3 doors. 2 had been sealed by masonry years ago because someone had suspected too much. The third, the one they needed, would open if one slid a coin along a crack and pressed hard. Tyrion counted the landings, the paces that Varys had murmured in his precise voice, and then, at the second landing, he heard a scrape above and froze. Voices filtered down the shaft. Bored, nasal, the weary malice that King's Landing poured into its city watch by the bucket. Said they rounded up 3 boys who looked like her brother, right? Dragged them in, and not one of them was 7 hells the one. Poor little shits. They said the smallest one pissed. Sansa's fingers tightened on Tyrion's sleeve. He put a finger to his lips and drew her into the shadow of a buttress while the light of a torch spilled down the stair from the next landing. A gold cloak clattered past with the scuffed authority of a man who expected the walls to make way. He stopped on the step below them, lifted his torch and coughed. "Bloody rats," he said, "to the rats or to the wall," and moved on. The torchlight sloshed away like fire in a gutter. They breathed again. Tyrion counted to 50 in his head before motioning onward. At the third landing he found the crack and slid the coin as instructed. For a moment nothing happened, and the cold of failure ran its tongue along his spine. Then the stone shuddered and a breath of sea came whispering in, rank and lovely. He pulled the door just wide enough for Sansa to slip through, then squeezed in after her, and together they walked bent double into a space that broadened, narrowed, then broadened again until the sound of water was no longer imagined but real. They emerged into a cellar that had once been a wine store and now held rotting nets, old barrels, and a long-ago dream of profit. Slats of moonlight cut the dim. Beyond, through a timber door, he could smell the bay. A shape detached itself from the deeper darkness. Thick chest, edged short with a beard that had never known deference. A voice came, soft and rough. "If you have the hook, show it." Tyrion slid the parchment from his jerkin and lifted it. The man took it, sniffed it absurdly, and grunted. He pushed open the timber door and stepped through. Beyond was the underbelly of the pier. The great bleached pillars sunk like teeth into the shallows. The tide whispered among them. Farther out, lanterns bobbed and a mutter of song drifted like a rumor. "Keep low," the man said. "Watch where you put your feet. Don't touch what lives between the pilings." "What lives between the pilings?" Sansa whispered. "Everything that likes the dark." They crouched and crawled, and Tyrion's knees filled with splinters. His palms slicked with old fish oil. He saw the city from underneath. The dappling lights, the rope scars worn into wood. A cat balanced on a beam watching him with the amused contempt of an aristocrat. Beyond, a skiff waited, oars muffled, a black grin against blacker water. They slid in. The boatman, Tyrion's bearded guide, pushed with his pole, and they skimmed out from under the pier like a cockroach dodging a broom. On the bay the world opened up. The breathing of the sea, the glimmering path the moon laid across the water's skin, the distant clatter of the quays where men still argued about cargo they could not see. The skiff had a tiny lamp hung low, shielded like a spy's eye. It moved with stealth. Tyrion looked back once. The castle rose like a cliff, half in darkness, half in that pearled moonlight that makes everything look gentler than it is. He thought of his father asleep in the Hand's chambers, of Cersei with a cup in her hand and a plan in her mouth, of Joffrey, whose laughter had no warmth in it at all, of Podrick, poor boy, sleeping in a chair somewhere and dreaming of being useful. He turned back to the bay and did not look again. They slid alongside a shadow that had taken the shape of a ship. A rope ladder came down like the skeleton of a snake. The bearded man tied the skiff, spat into the water with an air of ritual, then motioned Sansa up with 2 fingers. She climbed. Tyrion followed, gritting his teeth as his arms burned and his legs dangled and the sea breathed beneath him. Hands grabbed his collar and hauled. He rolled onto the deck, and salt took his lungs. The captain came forward with the rolling gait of someone who had been born on boards. He had the look of the East in his eyelids and the West in his appetite. His hair was braided with little bones and copper wire, and a ring of silver was in one ear. He looked at Tyrion's face, blinked, and looked again, as if one might be a mask and the other the truth. "You bring me a war," he said without dislike, "and a child of the North. I will need more coin for the honor." "You will have it," Tyrion said. "Take us north. White Harbor if you can. Somewhere to the sisters if you cannot. We will pay for speed and for silence." "Silence," the captain echoed. "I know its cost." He spat over the side and clapped his hands once. "Up with sail, snug the lines. Wake the gulls with your work, boys." The ship angled into the moon and caught a sliver of wind. The deck creaked like an old man rising, and the bay widened into the open throat of the narrow sea. Sansa stood by the rail, steady even as the deck moved beneath her. Tyrion paced with the captain, gritted through a sudden wave of sickness that he refused to show, then let himself breathe the salt and feel the city slip away. He slept little. Men who flee seldom do. He lay with one arm over his eyes and listened to the ship's noises, the slap and hush of water, the thud and mutter of men, the creak of ropes that were both memory and present work. He heard Sansa sit and rise, as if arguing with herself about rest. Once he heard her laugh, a tiny, unguarded sound, absurdly placed, for a gull had landed with surety on the very point of the prow and scolded the ship for presumption. In the morning, the ship was a plain of boards with an edge of argent water. Sansa's hair was a brown coil under her hood. She stood at the bow and watched the horizon run. Tyrion joined her with a piece of hard bread that broke with the sort of crack that suggests ill dentistry. She took it without looking and chewed. Neither spoke, which was its own kind of agreement. By noon the wind freshened, and the captain angled west to run under the lee of the Fingers before making for the Bight. He avoided the lanes the red wine ships patrolled and made use of currents Tyrion could not see but which the captain trusted like old companions. The day wore a gray face. Rain came and then decided against it. Sansa breathed and let something in her loosen by degrees, like a woman unlacing from a bodice that has held all it can. On the second night a light flared on the horizon and winked again, puzzling and wrong. The captain swore in a language that had too many vowels and spun the wheel. "A cutter," he said, "fast and curious. That is never good." Tyrion's heart went small. "Can we outrun it? We are heavier." The captain's mouth thinned. He raised his voice, and the crew moved like thought. Canvas climbed. The ship leaned and the water hissed against her. The moon was a wedge. The cutter's lantern winked again, and then the dots of oars appeared, tiny rapid strokes, like water spiders. There was purpose in those strokes. There was money, too. Tyrion went to Sansa, who had not asked anything. "If they board," he said, "you do as the captain says, not as I say. If they seek a girl, there are 4 other brown-hooded ones aboard for the night. You will be the 5th. You will be the last to be checked. If I am taken, you do not cry out." She looked at him and nodded as if he had asked for salt at table. "If you are taken," she said. "Then I will be taken," he said lightly, "and it will be inconvenient." She put a hand against the rail to steady herself not from the sea. "You will not be taken," she said, as if she had decided the world. The cutter gained. Tyrion could not look away from the knives of its oars. A grapnel flew from the cutter and missed. Another swung and bit with teeth into their rail. Men cheered low and ugly. The captain bellowed and spun the ship hard so the grapnel line slipped on the rail and went slack, then snapped as a crewman's axe found it. The cutter slid, buffeted by the wake. It lunged again. The third grapnel found purchase. Boarders came like roaches. The first man up had a face like gravel and a mouth full of broken stones. He wore a half-cloak of red golden weave. Tyrion thought of Cersei's habits. Tyrion did not carry a sword. He had learned what such a display invited. He carried a knife in his boot and a mind sharpened by fear. He slipped behind a coil of rope as the first boarder leapt, and Sansa moved the way a dancer moves, just far enough to make herself the shadow of another hood. The captain met Gravelface, and they fought like men who knew what ship fighting meant. Elbows, knees, teeth. Another boarder lunged toward the cluster of women at the mast, and Tyrion tripped him with a loop of line and then stabbed down into the meat of his thigh, not because he was brave but because he was there. The man screamed. The deck became a puzzle of legs and curses. Sansa's hood fell back. Her hair flashed like a flag. A boarder saw, blinked with recognition only a cruel mind would have, and pushed toward her. He did not see Tyrion's knife until it bit the tender place under his arm. He howled, swung, and Tyrion ducked under, felt the man stumble over him, felt the breath of the sea as the man went over the side and took his curses to the water. The captain drove Gravelface back with a belaying pin and then put him down with a sound like a ruined chair. The crew found a rhythm to their defense. The cutter, buffeted by wind and wake, tugged on its grapnel and lost its angle. A lanky boy with a crossbow appeared at the rail of the cutter and loosed. The bolt skipped and sang and found the captain's shoulder, which blossomed red. The captain did not fall. He reached up, broke the shaft with a twist, and spat again into the sea. "Your mother was a fish," he told the boy without rancor. The boy stared, mouth round, then fell back. The cutter cast off. The lantern bobbed. The oars took up their small, frantic rhythm again, this time away. The captain stood swaying and cupped his hand over the bleeding. He lifted the hand, looked at the mess on his palm as if it were an interesting coin, and shrugged. "If they are Lannister men," he said, "they will be asked why they came back without your heads. There are questions I would not wish to answer. They may have been someone else's dogs." "Not all dogs return when whistled," Tyrion said, and the captain laughed once, a bright flash of sound in the damp. They sailed north by the slow geometry of currents and fear. The wind turned sullen for 2 days and then found itself again. The sky lowered and dropped gray curtain on them that smelled of iron. Sansa was sick once and then refused to be again out of sheer stubbornness. At night she sat with a sailor who had lost 2 fingers to frost one winter on the Bay of Seals and asked him about northern coasts until his voice warmed with story. He taught her how to read the birds, which were better at telling weather than any man. Tyrion listened and filed it away. He liked to know the names of things, even those that could not be bought. When they reached the bight, the water turned the color of a sharpened knife. They skirted the sisters without calling in. The coastal lights were sparse and untrustworthy. On the 4th morning, a low smudge appeared that grew into a city made of stone and snow, built not for glory but for endurance. White Harbor had its walls and its river mouth and a lord that ate well and remembered longer than he let on. The captain gave them a boat at mid-tide and told Tyrion he had never seen him. Tyrion gave him a purse heavy enough to bruise and thanked him without jest. The captain watched them go and then turned his ship seaward, for the sea was his and the land belonged to men who lied to themselves about ownership. Sansa looked at the city and something inside her pulled very tight. Tyrion saw it in the way she held her chin. He had an instinct to speak and another to stay silent. He chose silence. The boat slid along the eastern bank to a small landing where 3 men waited dressed like menials but not holding themselves like menials. One carried a staff that looked like willow but felt like iron when Tyrion brushed it by accident. They said nothing, and neither did Tyrion. He and Sansa were led through lanes that smelled of bread and mud and fish, and then up steps slick with a recent frost to the new castle with its solid, humorless face. Lord Wyman Manderley had a face that should have smiled more often than it did. He was vast, a man who had never gone hungry and yet carried his weight as if it were a shield rather than a vice. His eyes, small within the ledger of his cheeks, were not small in their attention. He sat in a chair that had been reinforced by practical carpenters and watched them come into the hall like a man in no hurry to contradict a rumor he had hoped for. Lady Sansa Stark, he said, and his voice rolled and stopped and rolled again, like a wagon over stones. The North has been starved of good news. You arrive with a husband, and not the one your father would have chosen. Sansa's hands were folded. My lord, I bring little but myself. That is not little. His gaze slid to Tyrion and took him in like a mathematic problem he had met before and not fully solved. Lord Tyrion, I have heard you have a taste for honesty when it is inconvenient. Will you give me a taste now? Tyrion disliked the feeling of a man looking down on him in both meanings of the phrase. He swallowed it. I will. I have taken your lady from King's Landing. I will not say I rescued her, because that presumes she asked. I will say that I would not be my father's knife. If you wish to throw me in your cellars and return her to court, you may. You will be thanked by men whose thanks are coins that vanish in the counting. Lord Wyman stared, and Tyrion felt the weight of that stare as if a beast were deciding what to do with him. At last the big man snorted softly, a sort of almost laugh. I have sons, he said. One is home, one is not. The one who is not needs a clever hand to pluck him out of a web spun by men who dine on rules and call it honor. I have no love for your lion, little lord. But my lady's presence is a branch I had thought snapped. He lifted a hand, fat as a ham, and wiggled it in a gesture that might have been surprisingly delicate. We may be of use to one another. Sansa looked from one to the other and said nothing. She learned something important in that moment. That silence can be a blade, too. Lord Wyman gave them chambers. He placed Sansa in a suite that had belonged to a dead daughter with the simple generosity of a man who liked to be seen to be generous. And he put Tyrion in a room with a fire that fought the damp with stubborn courage. They ate in his small hall that night. Trout with the skin crisped, onions, a thick bread that spoke of men who plowed through frost. Tyrion drank a beer that had a stubborn tang and thought, absurdly, of the tiny crater he had pressed into candle wax, now days and worlds away. The next morning, snow fell. Tentative first flakes that melted on stone and suggestions of what the North kept in its larder. Sansa stood at the window and let the smell of it steady her. She had found, since leaving, that grief and hope pulled at the same place in the chest and sometimes felt alarmingly alike. She thought of Arya with the sort of ache that is both wound and map. She thought of Bran's stubborn frown and Rickon's impatient hunger, and the way Robb had smiled for her when she had braided Grey Wind's rough fur into ropes only he pretended to admire. She thought of her mother's hands, strong as a man's and soft as a blanket. Snow fell, and for an instant she was no one's prize and no one's pawn. She was a girl whose home smelled of smoke and roasted meat and whose father's voice was not yet memory. Then the ravens came. 3 in the same day, which meant something had torn the skein of the world. The first bore a hand that Lord Wyman read and folded without expression before locking it in a coffer. The second he read aloud for the benefit of his household. A polite request from Lord Grafton that White Harbor confirm by seal its loyalty to the throne and its commitments to safe harbor for those bearing Lannister writs. Lord Wyman cleared his throat meaningfully and ordered more fish, which was his way of saying that move along hasn't been refused, only delayed. The third raven came at night, wet and bad-tempered, and pecked a stable boy bloody when he tried to take the message off its leg. Perhaps it felt its contents deserved protest. Lord Wyman read it and his face changed. He did not have the sort of face that revealed much, but enough shifted that even the dog by the hearth lifted its head. The Lord's fingers tightened and the parchment creased. "What is it?" Sansa asked, though she did not need to. She had learned what silence could do. She had also learned when to cut it. Lord Wyman looked at her and then at Tyrion. His mouth found words and made them hard as nouns on a roster. A wedding at the twins. A slaughter. Your brother and your lady mother. Many more. The old laws spat on as if they were spittle. He swallowed, not because the words were large but because they were bitter. Fry treachery with a southern hand behind it. The room did not tilt. That would have been kind. It narrowed, as if the walls had decided to step closer, uninvited. Sansa found a chair with her hip and sat because her knees had decided to be new and uninterested in her business. She had been careful not to hope when hope was dangerous. Now despair came with the efficiency of a butcher. Tyrion crossed the space between them. He managed both mourning and thick courtesy, and another to Lord Frey that was too fat with sympathy not to be a threat. He did not write to the capital. If asked, he would have said the ink had frozen in his pen. A man who called himself a factor for the Iron Bank took his beer in Lord Wyman's hall and spoke of interest rates while his eyes counted the swords on the walls. He left with a little less certainty than he had come with. Tyrion watched him go and found himself thinking of Braavos, not as a refuge but as a lever. He had spent months staring at the throne's debts until numbers became a terrain he could walk without tiring. If the North were to have a future, it would not be paid for with songs. He asked Lord Wyman for a ship and a cautious flag. "Bravos," Lord Wyman said, and raised his brows until they were islands. "Those men lend money because they like the gravity it gives them when they walk." "I am fond of gravity," Tyrion replied. "I propose to offer them something they want more than Tywin Lannister's good opinion." Lord Wyman's mouth did something canine. "A rare commodity. And what might that be?" "The truth of the crown's accounts," Tyrion said. "The proof that my father's promises are pies of air. And the chance to invest in something that might, just might, remember who sharpened its knife." Lord Wyman tapped one thick finger on the table, then nodded once. "I will give you a fast ship and a quiet one. You will take men I trust. If you make them promises, ensure those promises can be kept by people who die for them." Before the ship was ready, a knight with a fisherman's hands and a king's cause arrived. Davos Seaworth did not look like a lord envoy. He looked like a man who had known cold in his bones and heat on his face both in the same day, and had taken both without complaint. Lord Wyman received him with courtesy deep as the river and waited for the shape of the ask. Came, plain and heavy and honest. "My king seeks north," Davos said, and his eyes flicked, despite his control, to Sansa as if the idea of the north were a person in the room. "He seeks justice for betrayal and the defense of walls too many have decided are only stories. He seeks allies with stomach enough to gnaw on hard bread." "I have a belly that has known many loaves," Lord Wyman said, and Davos almost smiled. Tyrion waited for the man to ask for ships, for coin, for men. He did, but he also asked for something else. A promise that when the banners were folded the slow work of law would not be given back to those who had danced on its face. He spoke of oaths like they were not just words but weights. Tyrion found himself liking the man despite a lifetime's habit of distrust. When Davos spoke, Sansa listened with an expression that was not worship and not hunger, but something like respect. After the talk, when Davos had eaten and warmed his hands and they had given him a chamber, Sansa went to Tyrion's fire and stood unannounced. "You want to go to Braavos," she said. "Yes. And then I want to put a stick in my father's wheel and watch the cart roll wrong." She looked into the flames. "I want to find my brother," she said. "The little one. They said he was dead with the other, but we never saw. There are places in the north where men don't go unless winter is on them. There are islands no one visits unless they mean to not be found." "Skagos," Tyrion said. He watched her eyes. They did not change, which told him more than a start would have. "I heard a name spoken in the kitchens in Winterfell once," she said. "I repeated it to myself until it became a story. A place where the wind carries the sound of the sea like a flute, where the people don't dance our dances and their horses grow hair that falls over their eyes like curtains. There were jokes about cannibals." She smiled, thin and fierce. "Cooks like those men would always have jokes about cannibals." "You think Rickon is there?" Tyrion asked, very mild. "I think hope is a thing I cannot afford unless I spend it on something I can do," she said. "Lord Manderley is many things. He is not the man to sail to Skagos on a guess. But Davos might be. Or you might be. Me. You can talk the cold into giving you a seat near the fire," she said. "And you are more useful to me where my father's name has already been burned out of the air." He did not like the taste of it. The thought of the Eastern bankers and their ledgers replaced by a voyage where the weather itself was a mood. And yet the thought of putting an heir of Winterfell back into the world was like laying a chessman on a board where every rank had been empty. He considered for a long time, then said, "I will go to Braavos first. The bank will not kill me and hang my head in their hall, which makes them the more polite danger. Then, if Lord Wyman can be made to see the humor, Skagos." Lord Wyman saw the humor. He thumped the table and laughed in a way that made the cups hop. "If the wolf's head shows its snout from a cave," he said, "the north will go quiet to hear it breathe." The Braavosi ship was a lean gray thing with a prow that curled under like a question. It bore a flag with a symbol that seemed to change depending on where one stood. Tyrion took 5 men of White Harbor with him, including one who had a scar down his cheek that never quite stopped talking. Sansa stood on the dock at dawn with her cloak's hood up and watched the ship slide away. She did not wave. That was a child's gesture, and she felt anything but a child. Lord Wyman stood behind her and said nothing. He was good at that when he chose. Braavos rose from the fog like a city that had decided to ignore the sea's rules. The Titan boomed with a voice that came from a throat made of waves and stone, and Tyrion grinned at it like a boy who had found the passage behind his grandfather's tapestry. The Iron Bank took him into a room with floors that made noise when you walked so that ekrets could not sneak up. The men he spoke to wore faces like winter plates. Tyrion laid out what he knew, each number like a stone on a scale. He did not beg. He made a case clear and cold. "In the short term," he said, "the Lannisters will make your ledgers look tidy. They have the knack of it. In the long term, their appetite always exceeds their stores. Invest in men who tell you no. My father cannot imagine no. My father cannot imagine ever being called to account. I can. I am." The bankers said little. They were men who liked to chew before they answered. One asked a question about collateral and smiled very faintly when Tyrion said, without flinching, "My head," because then they knew what he understood about risk. Another asked about the North's capacity to feed an army when winter was at its elbows. Tyrion spoke of river fish and grain stores and the stubborn talent of hungry families to stretch what cannot be stretched. He mentioned names. Manderley, Serwyn, Mormont, Ryswell, people who meant different things to different men. He left the bank with less than he had hoped for and more than he had any right to expect. They did not write him a sack of coin. They wrote letters, that delicate, deadly currency that opens doors and sacks cities. Letters that promised to be opened when certain signatures met certain seals. He had a ship, a cloak thick enough to kneel on snow without crying, and the sort of cautious blessing that could sour if not courted carefully. He returned to White Harbor in a weather that had turned taut. Davos had gone north with a message and a prayer, and he sent back a raven with both attached in the form of 6 lines written in a careful, calloused hand. "It can be done. It should be done. You will not like the road." Tyrion liked him more for that. The Skagos ship was not elegant. It was a fat-bellied thing with a deep keel and a crew that smelled of seal fat and old wool. Sansa insisted on coming. Lord Wyman insisted on a double escort and a promise that Tyrion and Sansa would not be seen together on the deck in any posture that could be read as power. It amused Tyrion that something as simple as where you leaned could topple a cause. They sailed under a sky that demonstrated as many ways to be gray as there were names for snow. The water had the dignity of cold. The wind spoke in a language that bit. Sansa learned to wrap her scarf so that her breath warmed her nose far enough down it did not freeze in little white crystals. Tyrion learned again the humility of a stomach that did not care about dignity. The crew spoke a tongue that had the shape of common words but a different gait, like a man who had once walked with a wound and never entirely forgot. The first sight of Skagos was not land but birds. Great, shaggy crows that rode the wind with lazy contempt, and white-winged things whose cries sounded like knives on wet stone. Then came rock, the color of charcoal, shouldered up from the sea at angles that suggested the island had been forced into the world rather than born. Beaches were suggestions. Real landing places were something like compacts made at night between men who understood hunger and men who understood fear. They put in at a cove where the ice had been broken recently with work and curses. Men waited on the stony shore with spears that had been made before the tales of them were told. They were tall, many of them, with hair worn long and braided, and some with tattoos that disappeared into fur. Their leader stepped forward and considered Tyrion in a way that was not unkind and not interested in kindness. "We have your scent," he said in a dialect that made inland common sound soft. "You seek a boy who likes to run. We have had him some time." Sansa's heart leapt so violently her first breath tasted of iron. She forgot all the careful words they had rehearsed. She took one step forward and then stopped, because stepping farther would have been stepping off a cliff. "Has he a woman with him?" Tyrion asked as if he were talking about a trade good. This was the theater of power in a place that did not love it. "A spear wife with a name like a sigh," the man answered. "She bites like a seal, though." "Osha," Sansa whispered, and the name was a warmer thing than she had any right to. The Skagosi leader nodded once. "They brought us a little wolf," he said thoughtfully. "He growled and slept and woke and did both again. He makes the old men remember. He makes the children run faster. He has eaten our fish and our stories. We will pay for the trouble he has been," Tyrion said. "We are not swindlers," the man replied mildly. "We do not charge for children. We charge for the weather." They were led along a path that had been a path only because men decided to walk it more than once. Smoke from somewhere found their noses. Furs flapped from a line and told tyrant wind to do what it would. They came to a hall that had the aspect of a cave and the smell of seal and iron. Inside, the heat was a blessing that did not ask acknowledgement. Rickon Stark stood before the hearth with a wooden sword in his hand and hair as wild as the island itself. He turned when the door opened, eyes black as an old well, and Sansa forgot completely how to breathe. For a terrified instant she saw every brother she had lost layered in him like reflections in rippled water. Then the boy bared his teeth at the visitors and brandished his sword at the smallest man. Because that is what a Stark intact enough to be himself would do. "Osha," Sansa said, and the spear wife emerged from the shadows in a single smooth piece. She took in Sansa with a look that trimmed off everything useless and left the fact. Girl older, eyes harder, still a lady even with sea salt in her hair. "You've changed," Osha said, and Sansa laughed, foolishly and gorgeously, because the woman had once quoted truth to her when no one else would. "So have you," Sansa said. "You speak like you be. Long to this place now." "I speak, however, keeps the boy safe." Osha's gaze went to Tyrion. "You bring a Lannister into the cold and don't think he'll freeze." Tyrion inclined his head. "I am very hard to freeze," he said, "and I brought letters from men who cut away meat before eating so it will be tender later. They speak of safety." He did not expect her to care about such things and was not disappointed. Rickon came closer, his wooden blade held with both hands the way boys do when they know they are children and hope the world might forget. He looked at Sansa and did not understand. Sansa went to her knees so their eyes could be what they needed to be. "I know you smell like smoke from a place that has never seen our trees," she said in a voice that had been warmed in fires all her life. "I know your hands are hard from rough games. I know I am the girl who sang songs too loud. But I am your sister. Do you remember when you hid under father's chair to steal the cakes? You told me if I told, you'd put snails in my bed. I told anyway, and you did. The snails made trails like moonlight." Rickon blinked the way dogs blink when thinking, slow and thoughtful. "I put the snails in because you sang," he said at last. "You always sang when the day was tired." Sansa began to cry in a very quiet way, so that all the women in the hall stopped listening with their faces and started listening with their hands. She put her fingers against Rickon's cheek as if to test whether sunlight could be felt in frost. He looked at her but did not flinch, and that was more forgiveness than she deserved. Osha watched chin high. "You sure you can keep him?" she said to Tyrion, as if this were a trade more dangerous than coin. "No," Tyrion said, "but I am sure I can make other men pay dearly for trying to take him. I am sure I can make a place where his teeth will still be teeth and not a story." Osha considered him for a space of heartbeats and then grunted. "The little lord bites already. He bites better with a pack." They left Skagos after 3 days because the weather would not allow any other plan. Farewells were brief in that place, where goodbye was a story you told yourself to feel better about the sea. Rickon held a bundle that contained nothing important but felt like everything he owned. Osha boarded with the sort of courage that does not see itself as such because seeing is too heavy. The voyage back was a set of hard problems the sea presented and men solved by living through them. Ice grew on ropes and made them cruel. Wind shifted its loyalties twice in the same hour. Sansa learned how to hold Rickon when the deck decided to be a moving floor, and Tyrion learned again that the ocean cares nothing for men's plans. Twice they saw sails on the horizon that watched and did not approach. Once they tasted smoke on the air that came from a ship that no longer existed and spoke no language at all. White Harbor was a different city when they returned. Perhaps it had been waiting for news. Perhaps it had been waiting for itself. Men cheered in the streets for the idea of a boy they had never met, and women cried without saying why. Lord Wyman took Rickon in his arms with a careful tenderness that belied his bulk and said, "Only, welcome home, little lord," which is what you say when a piece of your own childhood has been returned to you in the body of someone else. Power moved. It moved the way glaciers move in a tale. Inexorable, quiet until it isn't, grinding bone into sand. Letters went out under 3 seals. Manderly, Stark, and a mark Tyrion had designed that was a combination of a wolf's head and a tiny, very rude, very accurate caricature of a lion with one ear torn off. The North began to remember its own map. Serwins and Tallhearts and Mormonts wrote back in hands that had ink stains ground into their seals from years of poorly heated rooms and not enough candles. Men who had smirked when the phrase rode by stopped smirking. Roose Bolton sent a message that had all the words arranged in perfect order. Sorrow, duty, intention, winter, crown. Said nothing. Ramsay Snow, his bastard, sent men who did not have the patience necessary to hide their nature. They took a farmhouse outside White Harbor and turned it into a warning that had no artistry. Those men hung afterward from the city's outer wall, not as warning but as punctuation. White Harbor had decided what sentences it would allow from now on. Davos returned gaunter and more certain. He had special courtesy from a man who had learned his value the hard way. Stannis Baratheon, who had hauled his banners north and had the sort of grim satisfaction that attends when a man finally finds a job that suits him, stopping a hole no one else cares to stop until it swallows their feet. Davos brought word that the man with the red woman had scraped men from the cold and blood from the stubborn and made a line at the wall that held because it had to. I have seen men who talk about honor and men who stand when the wind wants them on their knees, Davos said succinctly. My king is the latter. He is difficult. He is what is required. Lord Wyman nodded. And what does he require? Bread, swords, names that do not melt when you stare at them. Davos's eyes slid to Rickon in a way that was both hope and a plan that did not dare say its own name. There are men in this land who will march for a wolf even if they do not agree with the wolf's friends. The Iron Bank opened a drawer when Tyrion's letters met the seal of Lord Wyman. It did not throw the drawer wide, but it opened it. Coin began to move cautiously, with a clink that sounded like skepticism. Tyrion gave the city's armorers a reason to smile in winter. He did not buy flashy blades. He bought hinges and nails and straps and things that made other things possible. He sent very quiet men south with very direct assignments. Go here, count their horses. Go there, watch the way that are. Iver runs in flood. Find this fry and tell me how many bastards he had with the washerwomen, because bastards travel with loyalties no one can find with a lantern. He wrote a letter to his father and did not send it. In it he said, "You always taught me to make a thing useful by the way I name it. Let me rename myself now and see if I do not become it." Then he put the letter into the fire and watched names become ash. Winter did not come in with a trumpet. It came the way old friends come through kitchen doors. Stamping snow, complaining, making itself at home without asking. White Harbor's river slowed, then hardened around the edges like glass that had decided to become something more serious. The markets wore fur. The songs in taverns turned from body to stubborn. Rickon learned to hold a bow that fit his hands. He did not stop being wild. The island had given him that gift and he refused to return it. He ran in the snow until his cheeks flamed and his breath huffed in little fogs. He slipped past guards because he liked to. He returned because he wanted to see the way his sister's mouth made a particular shape when she tried not to laugh. Sansa changed. She had come north expecting a fight that would be given to her. She found instead a fight she would have to assemble. She met with women who kept lists that fed men who did not know why their bread did not give out. She set up a room where ravens came and were warmed before being sent back out, because worn-out wings carry lies. She listened to Lord Wyman speak of oaths like ships, and she listened to Davos speak of oaths like nails, and she measured which was required when. She learned when to show herself in the square and when to be seen only by rumor. She refused to let them tell her she was Lady of Winterfell because the words tasted like a theft. She was a Stark, which is different. Tyrion grew less careful with his jokes and more careful with his documents. He made White Harbor a place where things could be done without anyone noticing, which is to say he made it a capital of a sort. He wrote a letter to the Eyrie that began, "To my lady's aunt," and ended with blank space where the plea would have gone if he respected the woman. Littlefinger had married her. That changed the arithmetic more than the warmth in the room. Tyrion had always enjoyed arithmetic until it had his name on it. King's Landing sent men, papers, and then a very expensive silence. Joffrey married Marjorie Tyrell before the snows hit the Gold Road. The city feasted with a hunger that sounded like fear laughing. There was no hairnet and no convenient collapse over a pie. There was instead a slow, tight leash held by the old lion on the wrist of a young king who hated its pressure. Cersei smiled at her reflection and ground her teeth in her sleep. Olenna Tyrell looked at the boy king and moved pieces none of the men in the room had noticed were part of the board. That is another story. In this one, a letter came with the seal of the hand and another with the seal of a queen that used to be the seal of a girl. Lord Wyman had a boil lanced the day he read them and thought the timing fitting. Roose Bolton moved. He moved the way a man who has nothing to prove moves, which makes him more dangerous than men who are loud. He took Winterfell with ceremony and a promise to repair what had been burned by who knows whom. He married a Fry, which is a thing you do when you have no shame and seek to make that a strategy. He had letters written in a hand that looked like the pause between breaths. He sent his bastard to do the work he did not wish to soil with talent. The night that Ramsay Snow sent a box to White Harbor with 2 fingers inside, and a note that said a child's name in letters that looked like scratches on a door, Lord Wyman fed his dog meat with hands that did not shake. "I have been fat and friendly for you long enough," he told the empty room later, and the room understood. The council in White Harbor's hall was not a thunderclap. It was a cold decision. Davos stood with his hands behind his back and said that Stannis would march, with or without company. Tyrion stood with a map and a cup of ale he did not drink and spoke of ice thickness and fry habits. Sansa stood and did not speak until men had stopped saying the things they say to hear their own voices. Then she said, "We will not write our names on a list kept in King's Landing. We will not send boys alone into the woods to pretend they are men and call that strategy. We will choose the place and time. We will show the bastard what fear looks like when it has a home." They chose the place. Not Winterfell. Not yet. Barrow Hall stood on its hill like a thought no one could dislodge, and the Riswells were clever enough to listen when the wind changed note. The Freys wanted to march there because it was a name they could pronounce without choking. The Boltons wanted to march there because they did not think they needed to want anything at all. The snows lay thick enough to make men forget how their feet worked. It felt like horses that snorted frost like little banners and chose where to put their feet with the caution of old ladies on market stones. It felt like swearing and steam and the color red somehow brighter against snow than anywhere else in the world. Tyrion did not take the field with a sword because he had a brain and because he had learned at Blackwater that you can command men better from slightly higher ground and worse ale. He stood with Lord Wyman on a low rise that gave him a view of the old barrow that was more a hump than a hill. He watched Frey's wheel when they did not mean to and listened to Davos's calm voice carry between cavalry charges as if the man were ordering fish. Ramsay Snow led with cruelty, which is a kind of courage when you apply it to yourself. He charged when the charge was a waste because he liked the way it felt. He sent men to die because he had never learned that death was anything but a trick other people suffer. He laughed. Sansa would learn later from men who had survived being near him, when the first of his hounds fell. He laughed differently when the second and third did, and when the fourth limped and refused to move, he killed it with his own knife because he did not permit betrayal from animals any more than from men. Stannis held men steady in cold that had opinions. He did not inspire. He forbade fear by example. Davos moved company like a man accounting fish. Lord Wyman proved that a man's belly and a man's arms could belong to the same man and not conflict, and he showed a mean grace on the field when he finally sat his horse, which made 2 of his sons laugh to remember afterward. Tyrion's small companies did what he had trained them to do. They fouled the enemy's feet with ropes under the snow. They cut girths. They lit fires where the wind carried smoke into hungry throats. They set up cloths to break the wind where their archers stood. They blew a horn at a moment Ramsay had taught himself to expect to cheer. It was a series of misdirections. War is stage. The rider drew up before the barrow and bellowed in a voice that had never made jokes. Hold! Both sides did, though obedience meant different things in that instant. The rider turned his horse and addressed the hill. Lord Bolton, he said, you know who I am. You know what I have done when men dishonored guest right. You know what I think of men who put their bastards at the front of the line and call it courage. You have men who do not deserve to die for your letter-perfect treacheries. Roose tilted his head, the way a viper might if it fancied a lantern light on its scales. He did not answer, because that is what men do when the only answer is laughter or slaughter and they have not had their supper yet. The rider did not require answer. He turned to the ranks on both sides, lifted his hand, and made a chopping motion. It was not magic. It was the weight of a plan meeting the moment it had been made for. From the small trees beyond the bolstered fry flank came men white with rhyme and silent as men who have decided what work is and are doing it. From the barrow's backside came Manderley's reserve with a noise that was not a cheer and not a howl and not a song, but a shape of sound that had teeth. The rope traps bit. The winds shifted because Tyrion had placed fires where he wanted and fed them to please the breezes. Ramsay, who had never truly learned how to retreat, tried to turn his horse and found that the beast liked the smell of a horse that was not panicked and followed its own thought instead. He rose in saddle, drew his bow, and put an arrow into the throat of a man who would have killed him. It was a clean shot and a useless one. Bolton's line bent. It did not break. Roose sent a signal, hard and clear, that meant fall back with grace and the lie that this was our plan. A configuration of breath and muscle that men under him had learned too well. But the snow deepened and the horses panted and the phrase lost their second standard and something in the crowd's will. Battle is a crowd, changed. By sunset the field was theirs, if by theirs one means no longer the other man's. Men prodded their own arms to find if they were damaged and were surprised to be whole. Fires were lit, the sort that warm and the sort that cleanse. The dead were named. The very badly wounded were comforted with liquids that took them where alcohol does not go. Roose Bolton withdrew, which is a neat word for ran without the dignity of panic. Ramsay disappeared in a swirl of hounds and men who waited to betray him until unsafe. They did not cheer. Tyrion had expected cheering and then realized he had expected a story. Instead there was relief like a room you did not know had been holding its breath. Sansa stood in the doorway of the hall where they had set up tables for soup and bread and the things one needs when one is alive and uncertain what to do next. She held Rickon's hand too hard and then corrected herself. They ate. They slept in shifts. They did not spend words on what they had one because the work of what comes after had arrived and was standing at the door with its bags. Winterfell, Lord Wyman said 2 days later. He said it the way a man says the name of a wife he has wronged and intends to apologize to, not once but every day. We take it now, or we let them dig hooks into her walls. Stannis nodded. We move while the roads are still roads. We do not give the cold the pleasure of helping our enemies. Davos made a list. He liked to write on wood because paper is a liar in winter. Tyrion made a plan. He liked to think that men were liars in any season, and he wrote with that knowledge. Sansa sat with Rickon by the fire and told him a story that had no dragons in it. Only dogs and a gate that made noise like a song, and she let the noise of planning comfort her like a lullaby. Winterfell did not love being taken. It had been taken too many times by people who told themselves they were coming home. It took 2 weeks of slow, careful work that upset the weather and the nerves. They cut the supply from a road that did not want itself anymore. They set pits under snow where men would not think to look because they were men not used to thinking. They found the proper moment to speak to the garrison not in pride but hunger. They did not offer mercy. They offered something colder. A chance to be where they belonged when the real winter came. Men are braver with a reason. Men are cowards when they fear they have chosen wrongly. Tyrion and Davos provided both. Stannis gave them an example. When the gate opened, it was not a shout. It was a sigh. The first men threw war wolves on their sleeves and faces like men who had had enough. Sansa stepped into the yard and felt the stones speak under her boots. It is a strange feeling, when the earth itself seems to look up and say, "Yes, I remember you." The gods would stood with its red mouth. Ice rhymed beneath branches and did not crack even when a boy stamped. Sansa felt the bark under her palm and did not pray because prayer had become for her not a thing to do but a thing to be. Rickon started to climb and was scolded by 3 men and ignored them all and did not climb, which made them all privately hide a smile. There was grief to be done. They dug in a square that had once been a place for festivals and now would be a ground for names. They found, in a courtyard wall, a place where smoke had left permanent evidence, and Sansa put her hand there and pressed. "I see you," she said to no one and to everyone. The raven that arrived a week later bore a slender ribbon with a flower pressed in its knot. Marjorie Tyrell had sent no letter, because women who lived under men's names learned to communicate by weather. The ribbon meant something had happened in the city, and the flower meant it was arranged with grace. A second raven came with a letter written in a hand Tyrion knew too well for comfort. "My son is king," it read. "It will do you no good to pretend he is not. Send the girl back. You cannot hold what you have stolen. Winter will come and make you small again." Tyrion laughed, once, and tucked the letter into a book of northern songs where it would never be read. He found Sansa in the covered walk that faced the training yard, her breath a plume of mist as she watched men relearn how to grip practice swords when their fingers were swollen. He handed her a small thing wrapped in rough cloth. She unwrapped it to find a brooch, not pretty in the southern way, made of iron with a wolf's head rendered almost crudely and a small notch where a thong had been broken and repaired. "This belonged to someone who was too much a Stark for his own good," he said. "It deserves a Stark again." "I am a Stark," she said, and pinned it at her collar. "I just happen to be married to a man with a lion's mouth." He felt the little shock the words sent through him and then let himself enjoy it. He leaned beside her and watched a boy take a fall and get up, red-faced and more stubborn than he had any right to be. "What now?" she asked after a time, and meant it. "Now we pretend we know what we are doing," Tyrion said. "We keep men fed. We keep ravens wary. We teach a boy to sit at a table without hating walls. We introduce Stannis to our cooks and ask him to try not to frighten them too much. We do something unprecedented." "What is that?" she said. "We win without believing the story ends there." She smiled without showing teeth, as Varys had once done, and the snow fell around them, ordinary and extraordinary both. Winterfell, which had been a memory and a rumor, became a place where footsteps echoed and a dog lay across a threshold and a candle burned too low now and then. Men were buried and men were born. Ravens came and went with small opinions. Stannis Baratheon sat by a fire and glowered at heat the way men scowl at their own mortality, and made plans that did not include his own comfort. Davos taught Rickon to carve a little ship with a knife that was not sharp enough for disaster. Lord Wyman told a story every night at supper that made men eat better because laughter clears the throat. Osha sat under the heart tree and did not speak, because she had given a boy back and had earned silence. Tyrion balanced accounts and lives and discovered the satisfying exhaustion of work done for people who might spit on you and might not, but would not lie to you simply because it pleased them. The North took its breath. Far away, the South drew knives around a table and called the sound of metal a blessing. Farther still, beyond seas and stories, other things moved that no men on this continent could hold back with coin or winter or wit. But for a season measured in the depth of snow and the length of men's patience, a wolf sat in a high hall and, though it did not howl, the sound of it carried. Tyrion went to the Godswood because he liked the way the air there made noise differently. He found Sansa seated on a bench beneath Brank. He's that had the color of mysteries. She had a book closed on her lap. She was not reading. He sat beside her and did not speak and did not need to. "I used to think," she said at length, "that stories were straight lines and that my job was to walk them well. I am learning that they are circles. Sometimes they are knots." "They are always knots," Tyrion said. "Men lie when they draw straight lines on maps." She looked at him. "Thank you for telling me the truth when it was not convenient," she said. "Sometimes that is all we have." "No," he said, and surprised himself with the gentleness in it. "We have each other, in a way that we are making up as we go." She reached for his hand then, and their fingers interlaced in a way that did not feel like a plan but something like a promise you make without words because words are not subtle enough. Snow landed on the back of his hand and paused there, undecided, before the heat of their skin made it choose. They sat a while. The day wore itself thinner and then decided not to die. Somewhere, a boy laughed, a dog barked, and a hammer struck iron with a rhythm that said, "Not yet." Somewhere else, a king sulked and a queen smiled a clever smile and a woman rearranged flowers in a vase that would be called a weapon, and a banker calculated and was content. Off beyond even those voices, cold eyes opened in places where there had never been laughter. But here, for now, in this wooden cathedral where a tree's red mouth watched without judgment, two people who should never have met sat side by side and did not lie to each other. That was a beginning, and in the north, beginnings mattered because winter taught you how to hold them without breaking them. When spring came, it would not be a gentle thing. But spring came not because men deserved it, but because the world had its own stubbornness. For now they had walls and warmth, a boy who pretended not to listen at doors, a city that remembered how to be a city, and the patience to teach their hearts to expect less from endings than from the long work in the middle. Tyrion thought of a candle with a little crater in its wax and smiled to himself without anyone seeing, and Sansa breathed in the particular smell of the godswood that was green even under snow, and both of them felt, as a quiet inside them, the certainty of roads yet to be trudged and maps yet to be revised, and the courage to step on them together or at least near. By the time the days made a habit of being short, men had stopped arguing with their breath. It rose from nostrils in white wreaths and vanished with the same soft stubbornness that governs fog. Tyrion took his steps along Winterfell's covered walk in layers, wool and leather and a fur collar that had once belonged to a lord whose heirs now bowed to Rickon because it was sensible to bow to a boy if that kept the old names in the right order. His hip had been complaining of the cold for a week. It made an old man of him in the mornings and a witty one by supper. He met Osha coming from the yard with a bundle of arrows under one arm and the boy at her heel. Rickon wore his wolfish grin for the air rather than for any person. He bared his teeth to prove to each hour that his bite was not a story told about him by other people. His hair had refused every comb, and Tyrion began to suspect that the combs had learned sense and stopped trying. "Your Grace," Tyrion said gravely, because it made the boy snort, and because mocking formality was better than living by it. "Going to bite the targets again today?" "I only bite when they deserve it," Rickon said. "The straw man looks like a fry. He deserves it." "Lad's got the scent," Osha said. Her eyes flicked sideways to the ramparts where frost hung in delicate beards. "The snow speaks different now. Quiet, like people who don't belong are moving through it." "You make me wish I had brought you south," Tyrion replied. "The conversations would have improved. I would have paid coin to hear you tell my sister what the weather thinks of her." "Your sister has a weather of her own," Osha said. "That's why lightning follows her." Tyrion laughed and let it be his warmth for that walk. Behind them the yard clanged and grunted. Stannis's men drilled like pennants, as if escaping fatigue were a dodge unworthy of their gods. Davos moved among them and among Manderley's round-bellied soldiers with equal ease, telling one to shift his grip an inch, telling the other that the stew would go further if someone cut the onions smaller and called them by a new name. The godswood had put on its winter face. The weirwood's white bark held its red leaves like old secrets. Sansa had made a habit of visiting it in hours that were hers. She brought ink there and a slate and sometimes no object at all but her breath. Tyrion found her sitting on the bench where the roots lifted the ground into little hills, the iron brooch he had given her pinned at her throat, the snow flecking her hair. "Melisandre would say the tree disapproves," he said as greeting, because he could smell the red woman before he saw her these days. Cinnamon and smoke and something that made the inside of the nose feel like a candle wick. "Melisandre would say the soup disapproves if it didn't simmer low enough," Sansa answered. She did not look up. The slate in her lap had the shapes of letters on it, scraped with a stylus that squeaked in the cold. "The tree does not approve or disapprove. It remembers. Sometimes it whispers as if there's someone behind me, and I look, and there is only snow." "What does it whisper?" he asked, more for the shape the question made in the air than because he expected answer. "That I am not done," she said. "It whispers my father's name without making a sound. It whispers that winter is not only cold, it is precise." He liked her in this mood, clear and steel-edged, as if the softer parts of her had learned that softness is strongest when chooses its moment. He sat beside her without asking, because asking would have made her either accept with ceremony or deny and then regret, and marriage, he was learning, was sometimes knowing when not to ask. "I had a visit," he said, "a bird with more sense than the hand that plucked its message. Your father." She tucked hair behind her ear and refused to offer worry the courtesy of changing her posture. "Not the old lion. Someone with smaller claws. The veil writes in the rounded hand of a woman who sweats when she takes her pen. I know Lisa Aaron's scratch. This letter had a man's finesse tucked underneath. That means Peter Baelish wears a skin he borrowed from her ink." Sansa's mouth was very still. "What does he say?" "That he offers sanctuary. That your aunt longs for you. That Robin's health is much improved, due entirely to his guardian's firm mercy." Tyrion leaned his head back, let a few flakes christen him. "He offers to mediate with the crown. He offers his version of salvation. A room at the top of a narrow stair, with a door that only opens at his hand. He thinks himself necessary again. He gets up in the morning by believing that. He thinks himself necessary because he arranges for other people to need something he can sell," Sansa said. "My aunt would hold me until I was a thing. She would rock me and tell me how she suffered. He would sell my suffering to buy the moon. Then we return his bird with quiet behavior," Tyrion replied. "We do not write back. Not yet. We let him suspect good things. His appetite will lead him where his learning does not." Soft footsteps made the snow speak. Melisandre came through the trees as if the red leaves had approved her gown. Her hair was aflame being polite. The cold had not found her, which made Tyrion's back teeth itch. "My lady," she said to Sansa, and did not say child because she had eyes. "The Lord of Light burns in a place even the cold cannot find." "We have a tree," Sansa said, polite as a prayer and nowhere near it. "We'll keep it." Melisandre smiled without warmth. There was no malice in it. There was conviction such as he had seen in the faces of men who had made good money off bad wine by assuming no one would dare complain. "The boy is important," she said, and her eyes drifted as if she could see Rickon through branch and stone. "He is a branch on a fire that has not yet found its woodpile." Tyrion felt Sansa go very still. He put his voice between them like a fence. "Everything is important," he said lightly. "Even the man who cleans the latrines. Most especially that man." "I have no quarrel with the old gods," Melisandre said. "They are not true, but they are persistent. I would ask only that when the storm comes, you stand where the fire can see you." "Stannis stands where Stannis pleases," Sansa replied. "You may tell him so." Melisandre inclined her head, as if satisfied that the shape of the argument was as she predicted, and went away as if no snow had ever been allowed to adhere to her path. Sansa let out a breath that was not a laugh. "I understand men who make knives," she said. "I do not understand people who make the sound of knives." She looked down at the letters on her slate and rubbed them out with her thumb. "I am writing names," she said. "Not a prayer. A list. Those who gave bread. Those who sent shirts. Those whose sons did not return. Those who returned with things missing and won't say where they put them down. There must be a drawer to put grief in. If there is no drawer, it spills. I am told the North keeps trunks for winter, Tyrion said. We can repurpose one. He left her to her tree and letters and went to the other place men pray. The hall. Lord Wyman sat like a mound of good earth. One of his hands rested on his knee and looked as if it had a separate personality. Davos had a charcoal stick and a bit of oiled board and was making a list as if the world could be fixed with wood and blunt instruments. Glover sends 5 carts of oats if we send 3 farriers, Davos said. Glover's horses had the bad idea to eat the good idea we had last week. They chewed through leather as if they had a taste for it. Also he inquires, politely, whether the boy is truly the boy. We have the Serwins to vouch and the Hale blacksmith who remembers the look of Lord Eddard's nose. We can take the boy through the villages when the snow eases, Lord Wyman rumbled. Let the old women judge him by the way he holds a spoon. They will, Tyrion said, and he will fail their tests and pass them, and we will choose which failures matter. He set a packet on the table. Tycho Nestoris writes from Bravos. He is a man who is pleased to be right and displeased to be wrong, and he is wrong less often than is courteous. He finds the crown's accounts crisp and air-heavy. He prefers the weight of coin to the weight of promises. He hints that if the North had a seal that told his clerks not to snort at letters, certain drawers might open. Drawers again, Davos said. Everyone with a drawer wants to tell you how useful it is. Usefulness is a drawer that shuts, Lord Wyman said. We will print a seal with a stomach in it, Master Tyrion. My clerks will love you. A boy came running then. Not panicked, not dignified. The gait of someone who had not yet thought to be ashamed of haste. He gave a piece of leather to Davos because Davos always looked as if he had guesses ready and would not waste them on someone else's nerves. Davos unrolled it and tilted his head just a fraction. His mouth did not move. That was how Tyrion knew to leave a minute in which no one spoke. The Dreadfort sends a message, Davos said, in a hand that might be the bastard's own or might be the idea of handwriting that a bastard would like to have. He read, To the thieves and liars who sit in my father's hall, you have my bride, you have my place, you have a boy who thinks himself a wolf. I used to think the Lvi's smart. It appears they are foxes. Send me the girl they call Sansa. Send me the dwarf you call husband. Send me the boy with the long name. Or I will come, and I will teach the snow to drink more than blood. Lord Wyman's dog, asleep by the fire, opened one eye and shut it again. Tyrion felt a pressure in his chest that might have been laughter and might have been the lack of it. Sansa stood just inside the door, because he had left it open, and now she was very still with the stillness of a blade on a table. Clearly, Tyrion said, he wants a friendly talk. Ramsay Snow, Lord Wyman said softly, and the name sat in his mouth like a thing he did not intend to swallow. He writes like a man who thinks words can flay, if you rub them long enough. They can, Sansa said. We simply don't let him choose which skin comes off. Davos folded the leather. He has dogs. He has men who like him because he tells them it is acceptable to be what they are. He has his father's patience and none of his timing. He tapped the leather with his finger. He puts the dead fingers in your pie and then writes to tell you he's a chef. That's useful. Men have followed worse banners, Lord Wyman mused. I followed mine into rooms I should not have entered. Tyrion, if a man were to wish this bastard to step where one had laid a board with a missing plank. You make it a game, Tyrion said. He loves games. You tell him there's something under the plank that's his. He steps. You take that from him too. He smiled thinly. We will answer him without ink. We will send him someone he thinks he owes himself. Later, when the hearths had cooled enough for shadows to feel brave, Tyrion found Sansa in their chamber. Not because it was theirs by anything but paper and weather, but because sums add up even when you resent the numbers. Her hands were in her lap. He had learned to judge her weather by her hands. Now they were still, which meant the storm was contained and furious. He will come, she said. He was always going to come. Yes. He will try to take the boy. Yes. She lifted her head. What will you give him? Bait, Tyrion said. And then a trap you will not like. He watched the muscle jump in his jaw in the tiny reflection of the window's frost. We will let him think himself more clever than he is, and that will be difficult because he warns people by existing not to make that mistake. She laughed then, once, a brief unpretty sound. Good, she said. I am tired of beauty when there is no use for it. She stood and moved closer, and for a heartbeat Tyrion thought she meant to put her hand on his cheek, which would have been too much and not enough. She set it on his shoulder instead. If there is a debt to be paid for leaving, I will pay mine. He did not move. We left, he said. We begin again. The old debts will come howling because they have no other trick. We will teach them to sit. By morning the plan had grown seed leaves. It was ugly and it was needed. He sent a man he trusted least to be caught, because bad men make the best messengers when you want the wrong person to listen. Rickon was wrapped in the ordinary work of being 9 in a place that wanted him to be 40, which kept him from seeing, and Tyrion decided he would count that as work, too. He went to the crypts. He had avoided them for weeks, not from superstition, which he had never been wealthy enough to afford, but from respect. The air there had the slow damp the earth is proud of. The kings in the north sat with stony patience, their wolves at their feet. The dust smelled like old pine and memories. Tyrion stopped at Lord Eddard Stark's effigy and looked at the face that had not learned to lie. He had known only one man like that in his life, and he had watched him die from a balcony built for spectacle. You would be a terrible ally, he told the stone. You would ask ugly things. You would make men feel smaller so they might become larger. You would make me behave. He smiled a little and did not know how it looked on his face. I dislike behaving, but the world is getting precise. He almost asked the stone for advice, which told him enough about his mood. He turned instead to the little statues at the foot of the grate. The queens and daughters had smaller wolves, and he wondered which of them had told themselves that you can stand behind a big man and so avoid the arrow. He let the quiet fill him, and then he left because leaving is what you do in crypts when you still have breath. The trap required something he did not like to give. A chance for Ramsay to send fingers that were not severed from dead men. Theon Greyjoy had a name that used to be an answer in Winterfell and had become a question. The Dreadfort had him, or perhaps Ramsay had him and did not know the difference. It is a talent not to know the difference. Yara Greyjoy Asha, in the language of men who did not learn their daughters' proper names because they do not listen near the sea, came in with the tide as a smuggler and a storm. She wore the salt like a skin. Her laugh had knife marks. Tyrion poured her beer with respect. She would not have trusted wine. You throw men's names on a board like fish, she said, and think they will stay. They flop back in the sea unless you nail them. We drove nails, he said. The board splintered, and now we stand on the fragments and pretend they are stairs. He told her what they proposed. Her face did not change. It was a good face for holding. Use my brother for bait and you swim with your feet tied together, she said at last. He bites when you don't want him to, and he bleeds when the wind is wrong. I intend that Ramsay bite, Tyrion said. I do not intend Theon to bleed in any place we cannot choose. He leaned his weight on the table and felt the worn place in its edge. Your father sent him here to be a hostage and left him long enough for him to learn our words an hour. Winter and forget the taste of salt. He betrayed the place that raised him because boys do not choose well when they think they are men. He has paid. He can pay less now, if he chooses correctly at least once. Yara's mouth considered the shape of fairness and rejected it. I did not come because I like your talk, she said. I came because I am tired of men who make banners out of my blood. Show me the gate you want me to go through. I'll show you what comes of that. It was a strange conference, held at a table that had survived fire because it had been forgotten. Stannis stood like a sword on a stand that had never been used as a walking stick. Davos held his stick of charcoal and drew a dreadfort neither of them had seen because he understood the way men think when they build walls. Sansa listened and asked quiet questions that made men less certain of their certainties. Osha leaned against the wall with arms folded and said, That dog will not leave its bone unless you give it a boot in the belly, which Tyrion translated into maps and numbers. We send 2 parties, Davos said when the drawing had been erased and redrawn so often the table looked like a shore where the tide cannot make up its mind. The smaller one makes a mess along a line here, he tapped the place north of the main gate, and lights the mess when the wind has its mouth open. The larger one waits here, in the curve of the riverbed where the ice is honest today and might be treacherous tomorrow. Either Ramsay sends men to stamp the fire and exposes his flank, or he does not and we smoke him in. Men like him don't like smoke. It confuses what they thought the animals were meant to do. Theon goes where? Yara asked, not bothering to pretend she'd patience to let men get to the thing slowly. In the mess, Tyrion said, with half a dozen who look like him enough to tell a hound a story. He howls. Ramsay hears his toy and comes to yank it. He finds instead a wolf. Or he finds the toy because toys are not good at being men. Yara pulled her hair tight at the nape, a gesture that made her face closer to her skull and her eyes more prominent. If my brother dies on your story, I will drown you. I'll hold his feet myself, Tyrion said, but I would rather hold his rope. The wind made a choice that night. It came from the east and found the holes in men's clothes with an intimacy that would have been obscene in a person. They sent their messengers anyway. Men who had no sense at all ran up and down the frozen river and found the places where the ice grown too low, then came back grinning, their beards rhymed, as if they had discovered women willing to argue. Yara's men arranged their small tricks. Twine where men would expect silence, oil with a skin of snow over it, a horn hidden in a log that would make a bitch cry out when you kicked it. Theon came into the hall to receive orders, and the men who had not met him before stared because the shape of him under the furs did not match the stories. He looked like a man who had become a space inside his own skin and learned to occupy that space rather than the opposite. His hands twitched when no one else made sound. Sansa watched him as if listening for something she remembered from years ago when the boy had been kind in little flashes, and then she stopped because it was not kind to look for that in a man whose face had been taught to expect the lash. "You know me," he said to her in a voice that had learned to be low to keep from being kicked. "I know you hate me. I know what you did," she answered, and her voice was not unkind and not merciful and exactly precise. "Hate grows in the wrong places. It gets into the bread. That helps no one." He blinked at that, as if it were a language he had not expected her to know. He turned his head fractionally to Yara. "Sister, don't make any speeches," she said briskly, and adjusted his strap with hands that had skinned fish in storms. "Do what the little man says. Bite when he tells you. Spit when I tell you." He nodded. That he could do. Tyrion watched the nod with something like pity and something unlike it, an interest in what Theon would be if the toy survived becoming a tool. They left under a sky that had thrown its stars into a sack and tied it shut. The world was sound and breath. Tyrion did not go with the parties. He was not a fool. But he walked them to the gate and did not say be careful because men who were careful rarely do the thing required at the moment that needs doing. Sansa came, too, because face matters to men who think in lines of link and chain. She said nothing to Theon, and Theon said nothing back, and something passed between them that was neither forgiveness nor its opposite. A kind of sour bread that could sustain. In the dark hours, Winterfell slept badly. The hearths made restless noises. Rickon turned in his bed and muttered a boy curse he'd gotten from a groom, and Osha smiled grimly in her sleep. Melisandre sat before the fire with her eyes open as if sleep were a luxury she sold to other people. Stannis stared at maps because maps do not speak back unless you have a friend to draw on them in charcoal. Tyrion lay awake and recited numbers. When his numbers were stern enough to quiet him, he counted breaths. The ones in the next chamber where Sansa slept by herself because they had agreed that some space was a kindness neither of them was expert at, and his own, and a third he chose to be someone else's, perhaps his brother's from far away because it comforted him to imagine Jaime alive even if his memory insisted on adding a grimace. Then the horns. Not in Winterfell. Outside where snow kept secrets. A single long cry, like a dog that's seen a ghost of itself. Then another, closer. He was dressed before the second horn ended. The corridor was a line of flame. Davos came from the stair with his hair standing on his head as if awake in a storm. They crossed the yard while and tumbled into leather and steel like bakers falling into flour. A boy slipped on the ice and fell hard, and the sound of his skull on the stone made Tyrion's teeth clench. The boy got up out of embarrassment and was therefore saved from kindness that would have broken him. The gate, the wind, torches throwing red into the white. Yara's men first, 2 of them carrying one of theirs whose leg flapped wrong. Then the second group, 2 short men supporting a taller who staggered as if strings pulled him from the ankles. The taller man's hair was a mat. His face had been rubbed into the ground and then into stone. The third group did not come, and the fourth had lost its leader and wore that loss like a new language. Yara went past the guards as if they were poor decisions. She threw the tall man at Tyrion as if daring him to drop him. Theon staggered and found his balance. His eyes slid in his skull like fish in a bucket. They found Sansa's face and held there and did not drown. "He came," Theon said. His voice had been sanded. He liked hearing the horn. "He brought the dogs because he swallowed. They smelled the one who was not me. They circled. I ran where you said. They followed. It was—" He made a small motion with his hand that meant too much to be a word. "Where were your sister's men?" Tyrion asked, not softly. "Under the ice," Theon said, almost wonderingly. "The dogs went first. He loves his dogs so much. He always thought the ice listened to him. It didn't." Yara grinned, feral and honest. "The ice never listens to anyone," she said. "That's why I like it." "Ramsay?" Davos asked, quiet. "He is very angry," Theon said. "He watched 2 dogs go under and laughed until he did not. He killed the third because it would not obey. He is missing a finger that belonged to his left hand because Yara's man at the bridge did not miss, and he did not notice until after." Lord Wyman, who had arrived wrapped in a cloak that could house a family, said, "We will feed you. Then we will write him a letter that does not fit into a mouth." The letter was short. Davos took the leather because his hand made letters look serious. It read, "Come and see." Wyman manderly put his seal on it, and Sansa touched the wax with the nail of her thumb and put a little notch in it that meant nothing to men who do not notice such things and everything to those who do. The raven tried to bite Davos's hand and failed because Davos had spent years on ships where birds are not permitted to make decisions. Ramsay did not come that day. He waited, which meant Roose had spoken to him or he had remembered some lesson his father beat into him when he was little enough to have had something beat out that might have been almost human. The Dreadfort lay as if sleeping. Men who reported what they saw claimed the snow on its parapets made faces. Men are unreliable when they are cold. Theon slept for as near to 20 hours as makes no difference. When he woke afraid and then realized the fear could do nothing, which is a variety of happiness. Tyrion sat by his bed on a chair that had been made for larger men and read a ledger because ledgers are easier for some men to watch than faces. He closed it when Theon stirred. "You chose correctly," he said without preface, because he would not insult a man who had had too much ceremony used as a whip on his back. Theon stared at the ceiling. "I did what I was told. I have not been good at that. It felt like being 10 without the cake." "That," Tyrion said, "is the shape of growing up, also of war." "Why help me?" Theon asked. "To use me again? Because it hurts him? Because you think it will make someone at sea do what you want?" "All that," Tyrion said easily. "And because I am tired of men ending badly without attempting to finish well." Theon closed his eyes and let his breath count him. "I can do one thing more," he said after a while. "In the Dreadfort there is a man who knows where Roose sleeps and which door not even his bastard walks through. He likes to talk when he drinks. He likes to drink when he is scared. Your trap was good because it made him frightened. He will drink tonight. If you put a man in the tavern by the south wall and let him tell stories that make men feel brave, that man will have a friend by the end of the 3rd cup." Tyrion's smile was a small knife. "There," he said, "that is worth more than a finger." The Dreadfort man with a mouth for drink made himself new friends and woke the next morning with a headache and fewer secrets. The little staircase to Roose Bolton's private room was marked by a crack a man's boot heel had left the year the eldest Bolton had broken his ankle. The step that squeaked had been oiled recently, which always draws attention instead of preventing it. The door had a lock whose teeth had been ground smooth by a patient key. Men who know locks know how to copy teeth with a candle and a clever child. There are always clever children in a war. They did not take Roose in his bed. He did not sleep enough for that. They took the man who carried his messages down the back stair and learned the shape of circles his riders took to avoid eyes. They took one rider off his circle and sent him on a slightly different curve. They moved, in short, like men who understand that war is not always the louder, and that cutting the strap on a saddle saves more blood than boasting. Ramsay came at last because he could not bear not to. He came with a fist of men and the idea that men leave in their footprints like a smell. He came with 3 banners: the flayed man, the field plane, a new one with dogs' heads in profile that meant nothing and everything about his private life. He came at night because he thought he owned it. He howled once, and the men next to him pretended it made their own blood hot. He stepped where Yara's men had found the shallowest spot on the river and put stakes just where the ice most wish it to break. Others took those steps after. Winterfell's men had cut their stakes with kindness so they would crack when asked politely by weight. Ramsay's horse went down first. He laughed when it did. He laughed again when the man next to him disappeared up to his neck, because the man did exactly what Ramsay had thought he would and flailed instead of freezing. Then he stopped laughing because he understood that the road he had chosen had turned into a suggestion. He turned to find another, and there were none that did not eat hooves. Someone shot at him and missed on purpose. The arrow sang by his ear and told him it could have liked his skull. He came anyway because that is what he was and what such men do when the world refuses to applaud their cleverness. They force the applause and call the bruises that result a result. He reached the outer yard howling for Theon, which made Theon put his face into his blanket and shake like a man who remembers how to be both boy and ghost. He reached the gate with a dozen men left who had not lost their nerve to the idea of ice. He found no archers there to please himself with being shot at. He found only an open space and, at the far end of it, a girl with hair under a wolf fur hood and a boy whose hair refused to listen to it. "Little lord," Ramsay said. He said it like an insult and like a thing he wanted to bite the way a hound shakes a rabbit. "Come, don't you want your father's house? Come take it from me the way a man would." Rickon looked up at Sansa without embarrassment. She tugged his scarf closer at his throat with 2 quick, competent movements and did not look away. "You'll come closer," she said to Ramsay. "Your dogs will not." He laughed and patted one of the hounds that had made it across, a scarred bitch with a milky eye. He whispered something to it, and it sat. He was surprised and pleased in a way that made Tyrion, watching from the shadow of a buttress, understand that the man had so rarely been pleased by obedience that even a dog's surprise made him proud. "You write ugly letters," Sansa said. "Was it your own idea to send the fingers? Or did you think that was how a man introduces himself after a wedding?" He blinked because insult worked differently when you could not answer it with a knife. He stepped closer. His boots printed dark in the snow. "You belong to me," he said. "You belong to me by law and by my father's voice, and because I want you and I always get what I want. Ask Theon." There was a sort of silence that follows a remarkable vulgarity. Sansa did not color. The wind made her hair move a little. She stood with one hand on her brother's shoulder. The boy stood with his wooden bow at his side, as if the bow were a gesture rather than a weapon. Tyrion saw his hand open and close, as if making peace with the impulse to throw the bow at the man to make him flinch. "You are the sort of man who thinks the world is a stable," Sansa said, very calm, "and that if you whistle, the horses will trot out for you. This is Winterfell. I will flay your dog," he said, and smiled because he had made himself believe it would amuse him. Small sounds behind him, the way frost makes when it decides to move. Someone cleared a throat, young and cultivated. Someone else, older, said a name that came out like steam. "Ramsay." Roose Bolton came through the ranks of his men like a thought returning to a mouth. He wore no great pelt, no display. He wore a look that had made boys think twice before pushing. He looked at his son. He looked at Winterfell. He looked at the banners, and the men beneath them, and measured all of them against a fact too simple to be a strategy: the weather. His gaze came back and landed between Sansa's eyes and stayed there, impersonal and oddly respectful, like a merchant making certain of a weight. "My lord," Sansa said, perfectly even. She did not add the thing men add when they wish to flatter someone whose power hurts them. "Lady," he said, "we will have business. We will have winter," she returned. Ramsay looked from one to the other and understood something, which was perhaps the worst thing that could have happened to him. He understood that his father had measured his appetite and found it inconvenient. He snarled. His horse stamped and snorted, answering the man's temper with its own. The hound by his knee stood and shook itself. "Father," he said, and his mouth put shame into the word, and his pride refused to let him hear it. "We withdraw," Roose said. "Snow will kill more of my men than you will. The girl has everything on her side that you refuse to learn. We withdraw and wait." "You make yourself a coward because it looks like cleverness," Ramsay spat. "I make myself alive," Roose said. "Recall the riders. We will see if the Freys want to feed their vanity to this weather." He turned his horse without drama and went the way he had come. His men went with him like fish in the same current, because the man had trained them to swim that way. Ramsay twitched in his saddle as if something were pulling him from inside. He looked at Sansa. He looked at the boy. He looked at the open place where he had expected archers and found air. "I'll come back," he said. "I'll make your snow red." "You've already done that," Sansa said. "Find a new trick." He went. His howling carried a long time, longer than the sound, which is the thing about rage. It lingers like smoke in curtains and sometimes gets into the fabric you thought too thick. That night, the hall smelt of onion and singed fur and men who'd be warm if it killed them. Lord Wyman told a story about a young man and a fish too big for his net. Davos fell asleep at the table and woke with a start, embarrassed and unembarrassed by turn. Melisandre stared into the fire and smiled once, as if only she had understood a joke too complex for other men. Stannis accepted a hot cup and scowled at its heat before drinking, because small pleasures had to be interrogated before being allowed. Tyrion found Sansa outside on the covered step behind the hall. Snow sifted in at an angle. Her hood was up. He could see the white of her breath. He stood where she could see him from the corner of her eye and did not speak until she had allowed him into the shape of the night she had decided to occupy. "You were very good," he said. "I did not fall," she said. "Some days that is all." "It will make stories," he said. "They will add wolves that were not there and leave out the men who kept the fires from going out. They will have you put an arrow in his throat from that distance. You will become things you didn't do and will be accused of them later." "I know," she said. "Tell them, when they accuse me of those things, that I would have liked to have done them." He laughed softly. "I will." She turned her head. "What will your father do next?" "He will write more letters," Tyrion said. "He will send more men with names that look like seals. He will tell Lord Manderley that fat men should not risk their chairs to fight for boys. He will offer something too generous to be true. He will be restrained because he will think restraint wins him what he wants most, to be right in a room forever." "What do you want?" she said, not as if she suspected him, but as if the answer mattered. He took a breath that turned to smoke and thought he saw it figure itself into letters and vanish. "To be useful," he said at last, "and to stand at the end of a hall when the day is done and believe that the work did not only serve my pride." "It is not a small thing to ask," she said. Then, after a moment, "You are useful to me." He turned his head and regarded her, and the snow gathered on his shoulder and decided to stay. "Then I will be careful not to break." In the morning there were ravens. There are always ravens. Some brought news that wore other people's breath. Some carried lies trying to look heavy. One had a gold thread tied to its leg. Men's heads turned when they saw it because gold still has the trick of making itself an argument. Tycho Nestoris wrote a brief note in a hand that believed in some the way priests believed in gods. He had met with representatives of the Iron Throne who had smiled and displayed figures that pleased only themselves. He had found the North's ledgers linty and honest. He had a suggestion. If the North wished for credit while the river was frozen, he could see his way to lending the weight of his letters to certain contracts in exchange for certain pledges. He appended names men in Bravos care for: a shipwright who could build iceboats, a woman whose weavers could make cloth that did not crack at the knees, a factor who could find cured meat in a port where no one spoke the language and still be thanked for taking the last of it. "He is a man with a drawer," Davos observed. "He is a man with a city that has the idea of drawers engraved on its doors," Tyrion said. "This will annoy my father, which recommends it." A second raven had come from the east. Jon Snow's hand had found itself a new habit, measured and clean, the writing of a man who had won arguments with men older than him without raising his voice. The Night's Watch held. The wildlings banged their swords on the ice and shook the gods out of the trees with their shouts, and then came over with their children and their shames because the things in the woods behind them had no shames and no children. There was mention of a girl with a spear who could put a point where an older man's thoughts never got that had the rough affection of a man failing not to admire. There was a line about Melisandre that did not accuse, did not flatter, and which read like a prayer for men who refused to say prayers. There was a tear in the bottom corner. Tyrion liked him for that. He liked men who did not mind being seen to own their water. Sansa read the letter twice and then a third time when she was alone with the weirwood. "He does not ask for help," she said when she came back to the hall. "He tells us what exists. That is more frightening." "He is his father's son," Davos said. "He will bleed for oaths when it is unpopular." He looked up from his little board. "We send him grain. We send him men who know how to build in cold. We send him every arrowhead we can find and the ones we can make. If we keep the wall standing, we will not have to rebuild it out of bones." "Wolves remember the old wall," Lord Wyman said. "Men forget because there is always a door, and they love a door." He smacked his lips. "I will make a feast, and we will cut the loaves in slices that go further than men want. We will raise cups and pretend it's for joy so we may count who smiles wrong." The Freys liked to smile wrong. 2 Freys had come north to prove that their house could be trusted to bring salt and chastity to a table. Everyone in the hall looked at them as if considering whether the right oven could turn them into something else. Wyman Manderley had acquired a taste for hospitality that made the throat tight. He clapped the elder on the shoulder with a hand as gentle as a closing chest and inquired after his father's health with a depth of interest that was obscene in a pretty way. The Fry tried to splay his courtesies across it and slipped. "You are welcome to Winterfell," Sansa said, when ceremony required that she speak. "We keep guest right like we keep winter. As long as this keeps your good lady," the Fry replied, showing teeth that had never bitten for honor. "We will all keep our rights." Tyrion watched Wyman's eyes narrow to slits of pleasantness and thought of pies. He thought of knives also, but pies seemed more right in the room with their smells moving around. The feast was not cheerful and not ill-tempered. It was precise. Men counted who sat where. Women counted who watched them sit. The boy ate too quickly and was corrected by 3 wom. And who said nothing out loud. Stannis ate like a man loading a wagon. Melisandre did not eat, and no one noticed because Sansa's head had turned just so at the instant a servant passed. And the room followed that motion as bees follow the queen when the hive is relocated. After, in the kitchens where truths are cut thin, rumor swelled. Someone had found flour on a Frey's sleeve and called it a sign. Someone else had seen a dog lick a boot and had a vision. Tyrion let rumor boil for an hour and then put the lid on it, as one must. There was no pie that night. Not the pie some men wished for and some men dreaded. There were rabbit pasties, which was almost as good. The next week 2 men who had claimed old Fry favor were found to have ridden out of White Harbor in autumn and never reached the place they had declared. No one could prove anything. Men did not need proof when the weather wished for certain outcomes. Wyman's dog put its head on the Lord's foot in the hall and stayed there, and this meant something to the wrong people. That was sufficient for the Lord of White Harbor's purpose. There was still the matter of Roose Bolton and the slow poison of being patient. He would not be pulled into traps twice. Ramsay's fingers ached and his pride ached more. Secrets do not like to stay in their drawers. The man at the tavern with the mouth found a knife with his name in it when he woke one morning, which persuaded him he had no name at all. Lord Wyman sent quiet men to Barrowton and said quiet things to Lady Dustin that involved horses and graves and the difference between laughing with the dead and laughing at them. She laughed back at him and then examined the bones of the castle she kept and sent a letter south that said very little and had dust under its seal. News from the south came pinched and hungry. Joffrey had wanted a tourney to celebrate his wedding. His grandfather had not. The compromise produced an event, not a tourney, a sort of waking insult. There were no dwarfs on the back of dogs. There was a man from the Reach who told funny stories about Dornish wine and was permitted to live afterward, which meant nothing was solved. Olenna Tyrell smiled with tiny teeth in a mouth that must once have cooed and now refused. The queen, still with her girl's face under the flowers, wore her hair in a crown that made her look like a vessel, and had decided to hold liquids as if they were decisions. Tyrion played each report against his memory of the way the city moves when it prepares to be ugly. It was preparing now in a slower key. Tywin Lannister had been given the tricky work of keeping his grandson alive long enough to become a fear instead of a joke. He would tire. He was not a man who likes to tire. He wrote another letter. He threatened. He offered. He named old favors. He reminded Wyman Manderley of a debt that had to do with ships and a son in a place where men with flags forget to count fishermen. Wyman read it and smiled until he was alone, and then he sat with his hands on his belly and cried. He dried his face, red-faced about it. He sent no answer. Yara Greyjoy came into the hall again smelling of sea and said, "My father is dead," crushed the room for a moment. "My uncle has a mouth full of gods and a head full of wind. The Iron Men will drown for him and call it a favor. I am tired of drowning." "We have room," Sansa said. "If you will eat the soup." "I'll eat anything that smells like a thing and not an idea," Yara said. "I'll stand on the wall and throw axes with your sentries. I will not bend my neck to any god who wasn't by my side when I learned the sea's moods." "Reasonable," Tyrion murmured. "We are establishing a theme." As the district around Winterfell began to be itself again in the manner of a wounded animal who has decided it can walk on 3 legs if necessary, the threat on the other side of the world men carry in their skulls came closer to the wall. Jon Snow's letters began to count things that men do not like to count. Bones, blue light, eyes that did not belong to any animal. He did not describe heroics. He described weather, which is the same when the enemy is cold. Melisandre went to the yard one night and performed no ceremony. She stood with her hands open and let flakes accumulate like pilgrims. Then she closed them and lifted her palms to the fire. The snow melted and the water ran down her wrists and into her red sleeves, and she seemed pleased. Sansa watched from the covered walk and did not move, because if you move while someone else is doing magic you get blamed for the fact that it didn't work. Stannis came to Sansa in the morning with the air of a man who has decided to negotiate with an enemy he respects less for the necessity. "A declaration," he said without courtesy beyond the hours he considered himself to have spent in battle. "The North supports the one true king. The North acknowledges the wardenship in my gift." "And in ours," Sansa said pleasantly. "Rickon sits his father's chair. He will swear to defend the realm against the things beyond the wall. He will feed men, house them, and pay the price that grows in winter. He will not kneel to the Seven. He will not burn his gods. He will call you king as long as you fight the Lannisters and the wolves cannot smell treachery in your camp. If you win, he will call you afterward what he called you before. If you lose, he will not forget your trying." Davos's mouth twitched. Stannis's expression did what it could in the space it allowed itself. Melisandre watched the girl and spoke for the first time in 3 exchange of breaths. "The boy is king here," she said smoothly, "in a way that pleases the old gods. We do not require kneeling. We require victory." "On that," Sansa said, "we do not differ." She paused. "Sirs, I ask for one thing. When men are named for their work, include the women. It seems small. It is a habit that affects how bread is cut." Stannis blinked, as if, A draft had struck his eyes. Then he said, "If they do the work, they get their names on it. I care who holds the nails. I care less who the priests bless." "That will do," Sansa said, and smiled very slightly. The agreement was written down by men who had learned to write in rooms with poor light, and the ink ran, which is appropriate. Tyrion watched the signatures dry and thought of drawers. He got a raven ready for bravos. He got another ready for the Vale, but he did not send it. It sat on his sill and beat its wings against the idea of waiting. The Vale did not wait on him. News came up the White Knife and overland on a donkey that hated its rider. Lisa Arryn had fallen through her own sky. The details were a rumor's delight. Tyrion did not need the details. He could hear Peter Baelish's voice describing the wind. Sansa read the small report twice with no change in her face, then went to the crypt and put her hand on the stone that would have been her mother's when the time came and said, "Aunt," and nothing more, because sometimes that is the dignity you can afford. When she returned, she asked Tyrion for the letter he had not sent and read that too, and then burned it and said, "We will not turn that way. He will come to us. We will prepare to keep him outside." "They never stay outside," Tyrion said. "But we can salt the floor." Roose Bolton made a last play as the winter tightened its hand. He sent a troop under a banner borrowed from a house that would be grateful later, with men who had the look of winter merchants and wore their swords under their cloaks. They came into a village and held a woman's boy until the men who had drunk courage enough to demand a receipt came out thinking they were brave. Wyman's men were there first, this once. They took the swords from under the cloaks and the cloaks from the men and the men from their horses. They did it without damaging the woman's boy and gave her a loaf afterwards with the sort of courtesy that makes stories move faster than men. Roose learned of it and was neither surprised nor enraged, which is more dangerous than either. He wrote a small letter to King's Landing that read like an apology and felt like a plan. Tywin read it and felt his stomach's old wound and decided rest was for other men. Through it all, Rickon learned to sleep less badly. He learned that his feet can point forward and that he does not have to run to prove they know their business. He learned to sit at council the way a boy sits in a great tree, listening to the wind and deciding which rumor was a branch that could take his weight. He learned to shoot his bow from a tower and then stop when he realized the arrow went further than his patience. He learned to like a dog that did not bite on command and a woman who told him not to climb and then taught him where to put his feet, and a man who had been a toy and a traitor and now might be a man again. On a morning when the snow had decided to relent, men came back from the gods, would carrying a thing in a cloak as if it were something sacred. It was a man red as a butcher's apron, and he would not stay dead. He had been found by a boy cutting twigs for arrow shafts. The boy had run so hard his breath tore. Davos made the men lay the thing down and then had them stand away because you give a corpse room either way, to depart or to get up. The Red Woman came and did not make a speech. She knelt. She put her hands near, not on. She watched. Her eyes were quiet, and Tyrion disliked her less for a moment, which he regretted after. The thing rose. It rose slowly, like a question in a dull speech, and its eyes looked like the color blue when it has decided that white is a sin. The men near it made the sound men make when their bodies move on their own business. Davos put his hand on his knife because that is what his hand does in surprise. The Red Woman spoke a word that sounded like fire from a damp piece of wood. The thing turned its head as if the sound made it curious. It did not do anything a story would honor. It walked into a tree. It fell. Davos cut off its head with the efficiency of a cook. Melisandre set fire to it with the efficiency of a midwife. The snow spoke approvingly. "We keep men close to their fires," Stannis said after. "We build pits we didn't think to need." He glanced at the godswood and did not apologize to any tree. "They are not common," Jon Snow wrote in his next letter when he heard of it. "But they are not rare. Not now. I ask you not to be clever about them. Fire and blades that know where their necks are. Crippling works as if they are men until the cold remembers them. We use dragonglass. If you have any left in your old stories, send it. If you do not, don't write to me to tell me you're sorry. Send me more rope." Tyrion read the letter aloud and the room accepted it the way one accepts the weather report from a man who likes the sea. skeptical and obedient in the same breath. Sansa looked to the weirwood as if calculating distances. Rickon said, in the tone of a boy who has used a new word once and liked it, "We will send rope." And Osha clout him very gently, because telling wasn't doing. The days kept being short and then, little by little, thought about being longer. Winterfell began to make the quiet noises of a place that has remembered its work. The forges found their rhythms. The store ledger stopped frightening even the nervous steward. The maester's ravens got fat and had to be reminded that their job was not to laze on the rafters and discuss the world in cause. Sansa walked the corridors and was stopped by women who wanted to tell her that the shade of a certain cloth was wrong for a certain room, and she listened, because these are the things that demonstrate whether you belong. She sat with men who had never thought to see a lady at numbers and had their pride spared as she miscounted once and then counted better than them on the next column. She learned to be wrong with grace in public so she could be right with force in private. She learned to send a loaf every morning to the women whose boys had walked into the snow and not come back, so that the bread would be in the house before the grief woke. She learned to say no to men who had preened themselves to accept a yes. Tyrion, who had always liked a ledger for the way it kept him from drowning in other men's lies, learned to like the noise of a working kitchen. He learned that a pot of onions and a steady hand can make men who hate each other share a bowl. He learned to stand at a window for an hour and watch boys learning to put their feet in the right places, and be happy without buying the feeling. A raven came one morning with a seal that had been pressed while a hand shook. The letter inside was from a girl who signed herself with a name that was 2 letters away from the one she had been born to. She used the word need like someone who had tired of every other word. She spoke of the hound, and of a man with yellow eyes, and of a little brother whose face she had seen in a crowd and had followed until she lost him behind carts of oranges that appeared when there were no oranges left anywhere. She wrote, "My sword is not sharp enough yet, and I am not dead, and tell my sister that if she believes I am dead, she should stop." There was a smear at the bottom that might have been a tear and might have been someone else's blood. Sansa read the letter and stared at it for a long time, and then she put it back in its little container as if it were a bird she wished not to frighten, and she did not go to the gods' wood but to the training yard. She asked a boy if she might have a turn with a wooden sword, and the boy, who knew how to correctly embarrass a lady so that she would not do a thing, offered to teach her how to fall instead. She said yes. The boy showed her how not to break her wrist. Osha watched with a look that was grudging and adoring and furious because she had protected a girl so long that seeing a woman step forward felt like a threat to her work. "Do you think she's alive?" Tyrion asked later, when the splinters had been pulled out of Sansa's gloves and the anger had burned down to coals that warmed instead of cauterized. "I think she intends to be," Sansa said. "That will have to be enough. Everything a man builds in winter has to be enough." The news from the south learned to come slower. The wind outpaced it and made it untrustworthy. Tywin Lannister's letters lost a little of their vinegar. He wrote one day asking after Tyrion's health as if concern had occurred to him and had been examined and found to be a tool worth trying. Tyrion sent no answer. He felt, to his surprise, something like pity for the old lion. A man who had climbed with precision and may now die in a room full of careful sounds. "Do you think your father will die in bed?" Sansa asked, not unkindly. "No," Tyrion said, and tasted the honesty before he let it stand. "He deserves to, which is why he will not. He will die with one small surprise left in his face." "What do you deserve?" she asked. He thought. "An honest sum," he said, "and a wife who will tell me when I am about to insult a man's pride by paying his bills twice and calling it virtue." "I will tell you," she said, and touched his sleeve with her knuckles because a hand would have been too much. On a day when the ice on the river cracked with a deep note like a drum, a small envoy from the Vale arrived. 3 men in pale cloaks, one with a steel cap and a scar along his jaw that made him look tougher than he needed to be. Bronze Yohn Royce had sent them. They bore news that had the roundness of coins and the edges of knives. Lisa's death had left a hole. Baelish had not fallen into it. He had stepped around it and made the hole better for his feet. The lords declarant were restless. The boy lord coughed and was coddled and did not grow. The Vale was closed and proud of it, and would be less proud when men came north to ask for help, because there were things coming down that no pass could forbid. They ate Wyman's stew and tried not to approve and failed. They asked to see the boy's face. Sansa permitted it on a day when his hair had been persuaded to a deceitful order. They were satisfied by a particular tilt of the head that Lord Eddard had done when someone lied poorly. They left with polite words and a sense that if they stood still too long, the snow would cover their boots. That too was enough. When spring reached its hand over the edge of the world and made a show of putting one green finger on the white knife where people could see it, men cheered as if they had either never doubted or had never believed. Winterfell did not cheer. It opened a door and let the air in and then shut it because air makes people foolish. The ground shifted under the drifts. The first crocus stabbed the brown with the sort of impertinence that keeps old women alive in villages. A man laughed crudely in the hall and was not corrected because everyone heard the relief in it. Rickon had his name day and did not like the way the hall looked at him. He preferred the hour after, when he ran with a dog and did not run from or toward anything. Sansa sat with women who had kept their families fed and said, "Thank you," in the right ways. Wyman Manderley composed a song he pretended he didn't. It had too many rhymes for bread, but the lads liked it. Davos set off toward the wall with 20 men and twice as much rope as his letter had asked. Stannis nodded at the thaw and reminded everyone the war was not finished because the river remembered how to speak. Melisandre smiled at the sunrise like a thing she had purchased fairly, and perhaps she had. Tyrion walked the outer wall and ran a hand along the stones where someone long dead had scratched a name and a number, and the numbers were always years. He thought of wine in the south that Old tasted thin to him now, and of a room in King's Landing where the light was dirty and turned men into the shapes of their appetites. He thought of a woman beside him who had asked to be taught to fall, and who now stood sometimes at the window at dawn and did not need the tree to tell her she was not done. He thought, and then he let himself stop and heard instead, with a clarity he had not allowed himself before, the ordinary noises that are the drumbeat of a place that has decided to live. Hammers. A boy squeal when a dog licked his ear. The wet smack of snow sliding off a ledge. The particular cough of a man with a pipe and a story to go with it. The sigh a door makes when a woman comes in with her hands full and the room changes because she is there. The North would have more work than pride. It would have more funerals than songs. It would have a king in a room full of banners who would make men swear and then take their bread and make it last. It would have enemies with human faces and enemies without. And it would have nights when the old gods seemed to stand up and count, and mornings when men said they had dreamed of fire and had wanted it on their faces even in sleep. Tyrion stood in the cold and put his hands inside his sleeves like a maester copying a text, and he smiled to himself, and, because there was no one to impress, he let it be ugly and sincere, which is what truth looks like on a man's face when no one is watching. He went down into the yard to find the woman he had married and the boy he believed in and the old men he had discovered he loved, and the work that would not be finished, and the winter that would let them pretend for a few hours at a time that they were making spring by wanting it.